All right, welcome to another session of Pastor's Q&A. Back by popular demand, we might say. Some of you have had questions, storing them up for months, and just ready to unleash them now. So I've got a good number of questions in already. I think about 6 questions, 7 questions maybe so far. But would encourage you to write down some, or text me, or email me, or just ask me in person. That's fine too. I can usually grab a pen and write it down, or try to remember it. To take on these questions. We've got 3 that we can cover tonight if we have enough time. If not, we'll definitely try to get through 2 of these questions. And I think they're pretty fascinating ones. So I hope you'll enjoy getting to talk about these. The first 2 really deal a lot with the early chapters of the Bible. Well, really all 3 of them do. But specifically the first 2 in the first few chapters of Genesis. So let me do the big reveal on what is our first question for tonight. Question number 1. How did people live so long in the early chapters of Genesis? Okay, now, who has ever wondered this before? Have you ever thought, how did Methuselah live to be over 900 years old? And not only him, but there are plenty of people who live to be over 900 years old. How many of you have thought, I would really like to live to be 900?
No. Well, wait a minute.
Yeah.
They stayed kind of young because they weren't talking about them being invalids, so 900 years in good health. Okay.
900 years, so maybe so.
I could have great.
You know, this really is a tough question in some ways, because in the early chapters of the Bible, you have some parts that are really questioned a lot by skeptics and by people that read the Bible and say, can this really be true? Like, you start off with creation, and God created the world in 6 days and rested on the seventh. And you have lots of people that say, well, that couldn't have happened. We know it must have taken millions or billions of years. Then you have Noah and the ark, and you have people that say, well, Noah could have never built an ark that really would have held that many animals, and it would have been impossible for somebody in that time period to build such a large vessel that would have actually floated. And how would all the animals have gotten there? All kinds of different problems and issues. You have the Tower of Babel, and everybody speaking the same language until... I mean, there's some sections in specifically the first 11 chapters of Genesis that really make you pause and think, could this really have happened? Is the Bible really accurate in what it teaches here? And this is one of those areas, I think. I mean, people living 800 and 900 years old in the Bible, and I mean, if you stop to think about it for a minute, you're like, man, could that have really happened? Am I really going to believe and trust in a Bible that tells me that people were having children into their 500s and living into their 900s? I mean, is it really possible? So that's what I wanted to talk about. How did people live so long in the early chapters of Genesis? Let me show you some of the verses that this comes from. You can feel free to turn to some of these chapters in your Bible. It would probably help for you to be able to look at them a little bit. Genesis chapter 5 is the first instance that we have of somebody's age recorded. And you can imagine why it would be the first. Because it was the first man. So Genesis chapter 5. You see the beginning of Genesis chapter 5 starts off with the family line of Adam. So we're going to trace Adam's line, and we're going to go down through Noah into chapter 6. But as we begin in chapter 5, this is the written account of Noah's family line. When God created mankind, he made them in the likeness of God. He created the male and female and blessed them, and he named them mankind when they were created. And here's verse 3. When Adam had lived 130 years, he had a son in his own likeness, in his own image, and he named him Seth. And after Seth was born, Adam lived 800 years and had other sons and daughters. Altogether, Adam lived a total of 930 years, and then he died. So this is the first instance, but then we have a lot of different names, and actually if you look on your handout sheet, there's a little chart on the right-hand side that shows the names of a lot of these people that are living hundreds and hundreds of years. Adam, 930, Seth, 912, Enosh, 905, Kenan, 910. You got Methuselah. He's the famous longest lifespan listed in the Bible, right? 969 years. So he holds the record for at least as far as we know, for the person that lived the longest. So what is going on here? I mean, should we just take it at face value that people just really lived that long, and they were wrinkly and walking around with a cane and a walker when they were about 85 maybe, and then they just continued to go downhill from there, and by 150, who knows what they would have looked like, and I mean, you would get to the point of absurdity if that was the case. So how have people dealt with this, and how have people tried to answer this question? Well, let's give you some of the possible explanations people have offered throughout history of the church and interpretation of the Bible. First of all, some people have said, well, they didn't really live that long. It's just exaggerated for literary effect. There's a lot of different details about how things worked out, and maybe the way that things worked out in creation, maybe that's kind of exaggerated. It's just a literary device that's being used there to describe how God would have created the world. And maybe, just out of respect for these early humans, or for some reason, the Bible writer, who we think is Moses, although the people that take this view usually don't think that Moses wrote it, they say, they were just exaggerated for literary effect. You have, in Genesis 6, the Nephilim in that section. There's just some really, really strange things going on here. And it seems like some of it may have been exaggerated. So that's the guess that some people make. Now the problem with this one, I think, is that it doesn't take a high enough view of Scripture and inspiration that God is able to accurately and definitively communicate the way that He wants to people. So that's the problem that I run into with the first one, and that I think there are better answers. So here's the second suggestion, is that, well, maybe this is talking about tribes rather than individuals. So the tribe of the family of Adam maybe would have lasted 930 years, and the tribe of Seth would have lasted 912 years, and this kind of thing. You run into a few problems with that. One of them is that a little bit down the line you have Enoch, who is taken to heaven. And it's kind of like, well, what do you do with that? If Enoch is taken to heaven, is the whole tribe taken to heaven if you take this tribal view? That doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense, and it doesn't seem to deal adequately with the narrative in Genesis the way it's given to us. So that doesn't really seem to fit, and the specificity that we're given as far as when the children were born and the age at which a person lived and then he died, it doesn't really seem to lend itself to trying to make this like a corporate view of the individual. So here's another option. Maybe they counted years different back then. And I think when I was a kid growing up in church and we asked like our Sunday school teacher about it, I think that's the answer that they gave us. They were like, well, they probably counted years different or something. Like maybe they counted every month as a year. And actually the length of somebody's life works out fairly well if you divide by 12 for a lot of these guys. It makes them about 70 years old when they died, when they're equaling 900 or something like that. So, okay, maybe this seems like a little bit of an appealing solution, but the problem that you run into is that one of the guys has a baby when he's about 27 years old, or 29 years old, I think, as you go down the list. Let's see, if you look down the list, you've got 135, 30, 34, and so that means these people are toddlers when they're having children. So that's not going to work as a full system. Certainly not. You can't say, well, back in the early chapters of Genesis, they counted months as years, and that's how you get these huge numbers. It's just not going to work, because all of the numbers would have to be somewhat equally inflated in order for that to work. So I don't think that's going to be the answer either. These last two suggestions, I think probably some combination is where the solution is. Particularly the last one, that's why I left it for last. But the telescope nature of genealogies is one thing that we really need to take into account. It's especially when you have how old people are when they're having some of the children that are named here. When we were going through the genealogy in the book of Matthew back in December, one of the things that I told you, and we even showed you some of the places that it happened, was that when a genealogy is given, it says so-and-so was the father of so-and-so, is that sometimes that didn't mean that he was the direct son. Sometimes it could have been grandson. Sometimes it could have been great-great-great-grandson. Sometimes several generations were skipped. And we talked about how in the New Testament and in the Old Testament, a lot of times genealogies are telescoped. In other words, you look at a long distance even though you just hit some of the highlights. And that's not the way we expect genealogies to be done. We expect genealogies to say these are the dates that this person lived, and this was his father, and he had these brothers, and then here's the next generation, next generation. You don't expect generations to be skipped the way we do genealogies today. But that's not the way that ancient genealogies were done most of the time. It was very frequent for them to skip generations and to just hit the highlights because they were trying to save space, and if you were to write out in prose form the entire genealogy, it would just get to be really long and even more boring than the genealogies are as you have them today. So that's one of the suggestions, particularly in these chapters of Genesis, is that maybe Adam actually had a couple generations before Seth was born, and maybe Seth actually had a few generations before Enosh was born, and maybe that accounts for, maybe it's talking about that was their age when this particular child was born to one of their descendants. So there's a possibility that that is taking place here. We don't know for sure, but because of the way we see genealogies telescoped in other parts of the Bible, we have to be open to the fact that that could be a possibility. But even after that, what you're left with is that may help you some reconciling how some of the births could come so late. I mean, some of the births come at 500 years old. You see that with Noah. But that doesn't help at all with the lifespan, the age that they are when they die. So, like I said, these first four answers are really not going to get us to where we need to be if we're going to make sense of these long lifespans. So, how are we really going to deal with this? And here's how, in my own mind, how I can make peace with a passage like this that says somebody really could have lived this long. If you think about Adam, how long was Adam made to live for?
Forever.
So Adam was made to live forever. So there was something about the way that Adam was created where his body wasn't going to wear out, where he wasn't going to see the effects of aging and time. He wasn't ever going to see those. He was going to live to be 930 years, and he wasn't going to have aged a day. And when God redeems us, when he sends Jesus for his second coming, and the resurrection happens, and we're given resurrected bodies, we are going to live in bodies that are not going to age, and they're not going to decay, and they're not going to die. We're going to live in everlasting bodies. And that is what God created Adam with. So the fact that death entered the world when Adam sinned is certainly true, and the Bible tells us about that. But it doesn't tell us exactly how it happened. How did the fall affect the human body would be the particular question that we're trying to answer here. And the picture that seems to be painted for us in the early chapters of Genesis is that yes, the fall did affect the body. It did cause aging. It did cause decay and disease and things that we see today. But might it be possible, and here's the thing that I think we have to allow for if we're being fair with the text, is it possible that maybe those things took effect slowly as time went on, and it was gradually that our bodies began to age at the quicker pace that's more familiar to us today? In fact, it's not even only in this passage, but there's another passage in Genesis, in the early chapters of Genesis, that lend credibility to the fact that this may be the case. And here I want to show it to you. It's in Genesis 6, verse 3. Now, this verse is kind of by itself. It's in the beginning of the account of Noah. But this is what God says in Genesis 6:3. My spirit will not contend with humans forever, for they are mortal. Their days will be 120 years. Now, this verse is kind of isolated in its context. It's in the beginning of the account of Noah. So some people have suggested that this means God is saying it's going to be 120 years until I send the flood on the earth. And that is a possibility for what this verse means. It could mean that. But it could also mean that God is saying, I'm going to start limiting the amount of years that I allow humans to live. I'm going to work it out so that the aging process happens faster, so that 120 years is going to be pretty much the maximum age that you see for people.
Was it that long before the flood? How long was it?
We don't know exactly. When you get back to these ages, particularly because of telescope genealogies, we just really have no idea what the time span that we're looking at is. You know, there was some guy back in the Middle Ages that tried to calculate when the world was created, and he came up with a date of 4004 BC. Because he took all these genealogies and he went back and said, this is how many years this guy lived, so we're going to calculate it all out. And they came up with 4004 BC was the date of creation. And a lot of people adhered to that for a long time. But what I think we realize now in dealing with the Hebrew text better is that we can't say it with any kind of specificity like that. And it may be that because of the reality of things like telescope genealogies, that it may be a much, much longer time than that. That even if you're going to take a young Earth view of creation, that creation would have happened much longer ago than 4004 BC. So the bottom line is we don't know. The earliest, in fact, one of the sources that I was reading on this one, I don't think it's in the one I handed out to you. But one of the sources I was reading said that they feel like the earliest date we can really have a lot of confidence in is Abraham, probably about 2000 to 2100 BC. And before that, we just don't know. So that they feel like with the information that we have, that's about as far back as we can go with any kind of certainty. So, you have Genesis 6:3, and here's one of the reasons that I think it may go along well with what we're talking about versus saying that it's going to be 120 years for the flood, because he talks about continuing with humans forever and the mortality here. So here's what I think probably happened from, if you want to look at it from a scientific perspective, is that the human body is aging at what is to us a very slow rate in these early generations of mankind. But as generations go, there are different, I'm not going to use the right scientific terms because I don't know enough about it, but there are genetic changes that happen. There are mutations and changes, and and everybody's intermarrying. They're marrying their cousins here. There's not many people in the world. Adam's kids had to marry their brothers and sisters. It probably didn't seem gross to them because they didn't know anything different. It seemed gross to us because we're like, no, you don't marry your brother and sister. There's lots of other people to pick from. But they didn't have anybody else to pick from, so.
But there were hundreds of years, so they didn't even know them, maybe.
Yeah, it's possible.
And another thing I thought of when I was reading this, I can remember thinking, gee, God made them last all those years because we didn't have anybody.
Right.
He was wanting to populate.
Yeah, the quickness, relatively speaking, the quickness with which we die definitely has a large effect on how population grows and expands. And of course, population is expanding at an exponential rate because of the factor of multiplication. And the more people you get, the faster the growth rate goes. But think about if we lived twice as long, or 3 times, or 10 times as long as we did, how many people there would be on Earth now? How many more people there would be than the over 7 billion?
But we're living longer today than we did 100 years ago.
Yep. Yeah, that's right. Mm-hmm.
Because you were old when you were 50. Mm-hmm. You were old.
They were dead.
We're dead.
But here's one thing that I think goes along well with that is that when you see the oldest person in the world, the news stories about him and everything, 100, 110, 115 years, maybe some a little bit older than that, that's about what you see, which would correspond if this verse is talking about that. Now, there are some people after Genesis 6:3 that do live longer than that, but what you see on your chart is that the number is consistently falling. after that time, which I think would go along well if God was not going to just supernaturally be like, okay, Jim, you're going to live 900 years, but your son, he's going to move up to this new time frame, and he's going to be gone at 70. So it's not this abrupt change that God made, but he did it over a course of generations, and he sped up the aging process, and by the end of this, you're talking about people that are living lifespans that are similar to what we live. So I think I find it to be intellectually believable that this scenario happens, that this is what we're looking at, and that you don't have to resort to that this is mythology or this is exaggeration or anything like that because of those things. All right, any follow-ups on the age, the long years of people in early book of Genesis? Yeah.
So maybe I missed it, but it seems completely obvious to me that the ages of people in the Bible starts to fall only after the flood. So before the flood,
Right.
it's consistently 900 years with some exceptions,
Mm-hmm.
and after the flood, it steadily drops until you get to Abram, right?
Yeah.
It's around 100 years, or the really blessed people last a little longer.
Right.
So, isn't that the explanation? It's not about bodies; it's about the flood and how the earth changed post-flood.
Yeah, good. I'm glad you brought that up, because that's actually an angle of the answer that I meant to include was what some people have suggested is that during the flood, the earth did change very drastically. We know that it didn't rain, for example, before the flood. The water came up from the ground, is what the Bible says. So there was rain. There seemed to be great geological upheaval. In fact, young Earth creationists point to the flood as the reason that things like the Grand Canyon exist and that fossils are buried under layers and layers of earth because of the flood. It altered the function of the earth. Now, what some people have suggested because of this is maybe the magnetic pole of the earth was significantly greater during that time, and that was one of the factors in causing people to age at a much slower rate. And some people point to like how magnets can be used to help joint pain, and some people have said there are scientific benefits to magnets and like sleeping on a magnet bed and things like that. I don't know if it's real or not.
The only thing I'd say about that is, scientifically, most of what you just said is complete bunk. If the magnetic field were really strong, it might stop all those particles that come from outer space
Okay.
from hitting you,
Yeah.
which probably age you and kill things. And, might keep those particles out of the earth.
So you don't think that there's anything to the magnet there?
No.
So, yeah, and like I said, there may not be, but showing that principle, that there may have been something very different about the earth in that time period. We don't have any way of going back and seeing what it was or what it may have been. Like I said, some people have suggested magnets. I don't have any idea if there's anything to that or not, or what the real reason would have been. But maybe it was something about the earth being different, something functioned different. The air was better, the food was better, the water was better. Who knows? It all helped the body to age at a different rate.
Probably
Maybe-
the ozone layer.
Yeah, maybe something. The bottom line is we just don't know, but we do know that the earth was dramatically different, and that the way that people lived on that during that time was dramatically different as well. So when you put all of those things together, I think it makes perfectly good sense to say things were really different back then. We don't know all the details. The Bible doesn't give us the scientific formulas for how all of this stuff works out, but it seems to be entirely possible that this could be the reality of the situation. So, yeah, so the changes in the earth, a lot of people have surmised that could have had something to do with the longevity of people living. Maybe the earth was more conducive to living a longer time back then. So, yeah, and is there some correlation between that and like I said, the quicker aging of bodies? I don't know. Could be, could not, might not be.
Well, we didn't help ourselves because a lot of bad things have been man-made, asbestos, whatnot. Who made all of these things that we thought were great?
Yeah.
Different refrigerants that were super great, but it deteriorated the ozone. So then they said, "Oh, well, we're going to stop making these things and do different things."
Yeah. Yeah, a lot of different factors in there, but, I mean, the good thing is that regardless of all of those, God is going to redeem creation, and He's going to redeem our bodies. And creation is going to last forever, and our bodies are going to last forever. Those of us that have trusted in Christ. So, a lot of speculation when you get to a question like this, but I think there's, at least in my own mind, how have I been able to satisfy that? Intellectually, in my own mind, that's the way that I've been able to. All right?